Listen closely, because what happens in the very first instant after death is nothing like what most people imagine. It is not slow, it is not gentle, and it is not a gradual fading into peace, darkness, or silence. Instead, it is instant, sharp, and overwhelming in its absolute clarity. The moment life ends, there is no drifting, no easing out of awareness, and no soft transition into unconsciousness. The soul is pulled directly into a reality that is more intense and more precise than anything ever experienced during physical life. Everything familiar disappears at once. Every distraction that once filled the mind is gone in a single moment, and what remains is not confusion, but truth in its purest and most direct form, with nothing left to soften it or delay its impact. In that first instant, every illusion built during life collapses completely. Nothing survives that moment of separation between body and soul except reality itself. Many people assume this transition will feel peaceful, almost like a comforting arrival into light, as if the soul is gently welcomed without urgency or weight. That idea is emotionally comforting, and it is easy to hold on to because it softens the fear of the unknown. But truth is not shaped by comfort alone. It is grounded in something far more serious, something consistent across scripture, tradition, and long-standing theological understanding. And when that framework is taken seriously, the picture of death is not one of gradual emotional fading, but of immediate exposure to what has always been true beneath the surface of life. Death is not symbolic, and it is not vague. It is a precise transition where everything hidden becomes fully visible at once. The soul does not slowly come to understand its condition. It understands instantly. There is no delay in awareness, no gradual unfolding of realization, and no space for confusion to remain. Every excuse that once supported self-understanding disappears in that moment. Every internal justification that shaped behavior in life loses all power. What remains is not a fragmented memory of existence, but a complete and unified awareness of what the soul has become through all of its choices. At the center of this understanding is what has traditionally been called particular judgment. This is not a process that unfolds over time, and it is not a discussion or evaluation that develops gradually. It is a single, direct act of divine knowledge, occurring at the exact moment the soul separates from the body. It does not require time because it exists outside the limits of time itself. Time belongs to physical existence, not to the soul once it has left the body. In that state, there is no waiting, no sequence, and no delay. The judgment is immediate, complete, and unavoidable. What makes this moment so overwhelming is not that God suddenly becomes distant or severe, but that the soul can no longer avoid seeing itself as it truly is. During life, human perception is always limited. Emotions distort clarity. Habits weaken awareness, and constant distractions interfere with honest self-reflection. Even conscience, though present, is often ignored, softened, or reinterpreted through repeated compromise. Over time, this creates a kind of internal fog where truth is partially seen but never fully faced. At death, that fog disappears instantly. Every layer of distortion is removed at once. The soul is left in a state of complete moral clarity, where nothing is hidden, reduced, or reshaped by emotion. Every choice made throughout life becomes fully visible in a single, unified understanding. Acts of love, moments of selfishness, responses to grace, and repeated rejections of truth are no longer scattered memories. They are seen as one continuous reality that reveals what the soul has been forming within itself over time. In that moment, a person does not simply remember what they did, they understand what those actions created within them. The judgment is not first external, but internal. It takes place within the deepest level of understanding, where the soul can no longer separate itself from truth. There is no possibility of self-deception because the ability to distort reality no longer exists. What remains is pure recognition, without filters, without reinterpretation, and without escape. And in that recognition, something becomes unavoidable. The soul sees exactly whether its life has moved toward truth or away from it, not in fragments and not in emotional impressions, but in a complete and final awareness of direction. Nothing is unclear. Nothing is uncertain. Everything is understood with absolute precision. And that clarity defines the entire experience of that first moment beyond physical life. In that moment of absolute clarity, this awareness does not remain limited to self-judgment alone. It immediately expands into a deeper layer of reality that was always present but rarely recognized during physical life. The soul does not remain in isolation. It becomes aware that it has entered a fully spiritual environment where unseen realities are no longer distant concepts, but immediate presence. What was once hidden behind physical limitation now becomes fully active, and the soul begins to understand that existence was never purely physical, even during earthly life. At the moment of death, the spiritual world is no longer something abstract or symbolic. It becomes direct and unmistakable. Many people during life tend to think of spiritual beings as distant ideas or poetic images used to express moral truths. But within consistent theological understanding, these are not symbolic figures. They are real intelligences created within divine order, fully aware, fully present, and directly involved in the unfolding of human existence in ways that are usually unseen. Among these spiritual beings is the presence traditionally understood as the guardian angel. From the beginning of life, each person is believed to be accompanied by this guiding presence. During everyday existence, this presence does not impose itself or override human freedom. Instead, its influence is subtle, working through conscience, inner prompting, quiet direction, and moments of awareness that can easily be ignored or dismissed. Especially in moments of distraction, emotional confusion, or repeated habits, this guidance often goes unnoticed, even though it remains present throughout. However, at death, what was once subtle becomes fully revealed. The soul suddenly understands that it was never alone in any moment of its life. Every decision, every moral turning point, every act of generosity or selfishness, and every response to truth was lived within a spiritual awareness that witnessed without interruption. Nothing was ever hidden from this reality, even when it felt private or unnoticed in human terms. The entire life is now seen as something that unfolded within constant spiritual presence. The guardian angel, in this understanding, does not act as a defense or advocate in a courtroom-like process. Judgment does not operate as a debate or negotiation. It belongs entirely to divine authority. Instead, the role of the guardian is understood as witness to the formation of the soul across time. It reveals, in perfect clarity, how a person responded to grace, how they accepted or resisted truth, and how their inner life developed through repeated choices. This is not an emotional role, but a revealing one. It brings full transparency to what was shaped during life, without forcing interpretation. Alongside this presence, another spiritual reality becomes clear, one that is often avoided in modern reflection. This is the presence of fallen spiritual beings, traditionally understood as those who rejected divine order. These are not symbolic representations of evil, but personal intelligences described as having turned away from truth. Their role is not to create moral failure within the soul, but to reveal what already exists within it. They do not invent guilt or place blame where none exists. Instead, they expose the reality of choices that were freely made. However, their presence is not independent or chaotic. It is connected to the inner formation of the human will. Throughout life, repeated choices shape internal patterns. Over time, these patterns form habits, and those habits gradually influence desire itself. What begins as individual actions slowly becomes a direction. By the time of death, that direction is no longer forming. It is complete. The soul sees itself clearly, without distortion, and understands the trajectory it has freely taken through its own repeated decisions. In this context, the presence of opposing spiritual forces is not about external control, but about reflection. What they reveal is not something newly introduced at death, but something that was already formed within the soul during life. They highlight the established reality of moral direction rather than creating it. This distinction is essential because it removes the idea that anything is imposed externally that was not already freely shaped internally over time. At the same time, for those who lived in alignment with truth, this revelation does not come as destruction, but as clarity. The presence of the guardian angel becomes a reminder of guidance that was often unnoticed but consistently present. The soul begins to understand how often it was protected from deeper harm, how often it was gently directed away from greater failure, and how many moments of grace were offered even when they were not fully recognized or accepted at the time. This realization does not create pride, but humility. The soul sees that its movement toward truth was never entirely self-generated. It was supported in ways that were not always visible during life. Yet even this awareness does not replace judgment. It simply completes understanding. It reveals the full structure of how a life was formed within both human freedom and divine assistance working together throughout time. All spiritual beings, whether faithful or fallen, are understood within a larger divine order. They do not operate outside of it or beyond it. Their presence exists within a structured reality governed by truth and justice. Nothing in this system is random or disconnected. Everything functions within a greater framework that was always present, even when unseen during physical life. At death, that framework becomes fully visible. The soul no longer interprets reality through physical senses or emotional limitation. It perceives directly, without filters. And in that direct perception, it begins to realize something fundamental. The moment of death is not introducing a new world. It is revealing the world that was always present beneath physical experience. This realization becomes increasingly unavoidable as awareness deepens. What once seemed distant or uncertain now appears immediate and complete. The invisible order that surrounded life is no longer hidden. It is fully present, fully active, and fully understood. And within that understanding, the soul begins to move toward an even deeper encounter, one that is no longer primarily about spiritual presence around it, but about truth itself standing directly before it without any separation. As this awareness deepens, the focus begins to shift away from external spiritual presence and moves towards something far more direct, far more personal, and far more absolute. The soul is no longer only aware of being surrounded by spiritual realities. It now enters a stage where it stands completely alone before truth itself. Not truth as an idea, not truth as a belief, but truth as an absolute and living reality that reveals everything without distortion or delay. At this point, the experience becomes entirely inward. There are no longer layers of external interpretation or surrounding spiritual activity that shape perception. Everything turns toward the deepest center of the soul's understanding. The soul now stands face to face with what it has become through the full course of its life. Nothing is distant anymore. Nothing is symbolic. Everything is immediate, direct, and fully exposed. This is where the meaning of particular judgment becomes fully clear. It is not God discovering something new about the soul. Nothing about the soul is hidden from divine knowledge at any point. Instead, it is the soul being brought into a condition where it can finally see itself without any distortion for the first time. The judgment is not about divine awareness. It is about complete human clarity. The soul is placed in a state where everything about its existence becomes fully visible at once, without confusion, without limitation, and without the ability to reinterpret what is seen. In this illumination, the intellect itself becomes fully open to truth. No longer restricted by time, emotion, or imagination. The soul now perceives reality in its total structure. Every moral act, every intention, every decision, and every inner movement of life is no longer experienced as isolated events. Instead, they are understood as part of a single connected formation. What once appeared as small or ordinary choices are now seen in their full significance. Repeated decisions are no longer neutral moments. They are recognized as forces that shaped desire itself. Over time, these desires formed habits, and those habits gradually shape the identity of the soul. What seemed insignificant in the moment of action is now revealed as part of a continuous process that defined the entire interior structure of a person's life. This is why the judgment feels absolute. It is not arbitrary or externally imposed. It is the final unveiling of a process that was always unfolding. The soul is not being assigned something unrelated to its life. It is being shown exactly what it became through the freedom it exercised over time. Nothing is added, and nothing is removed. Only truth remains. At this stage, all confusion disappears completely. There is no argument, no defense, and no reinterpretation of the past. The soul no longer has the ability to separate intention from reality. What remains is pure recognition. The soul understands its orientation in relation to truth with complete certainty, without emotional distortion or intellectual resistance. For those who lived in cooperation with grace, this recognition carries a complex experience. There is sorrow, because imperfections are now seen with perfect clarity, no longer softened by earthly limitation. Moments of failure, hesitation, or missed opportunities are understood more deeply than they ever were during life. Yet alongside this sorrow exists understanding. The soul sees that grace was present throughout its entire journey, even in moments when it was not fully recognized or consciously received. This awareness does not lead to despair. Instead, it leads to humility. The soul recognizes that its movement toward goodness was never entirely self-generated. It was sustained, guided, and supported in ways that were not always visible in the moment. Life is no longer viewed as a sequence of isolated successes or failures, but as a continuous interaction between human freedom and divine assistance, working together throughout time. For those who repeatedly turned away from truth, the same clarity reveals a different reality. There is no confusion about direction. The pattern of life is fully visible, and the repeated rejection of truth is no longer seen as isolated incidents, but as a consistent orientation of the will. What may have once been justified or minimized is now understood in full relation to reality itself, without distortion or excuse. Importantly, this experience is not presented as external punishment imposed by God. It is the natural consequence of seeing oneself without illusion. The pain does not come from deception being forced upon the soul, but from deception being removed. Clarity itself becomes overwhelming when nothing remains to soften the truth. At this point, something essential becomes clear. Freedom is not taken away at death. Instead, it is fully revealed. Every choice made during life contributed to shaping the will. Repeated actions formed desires, and those desires strengthened a particular direction within the soul. Over time, this direction became the identity of the person's interior life. Death does not change that direction. It reveals it in its completed form. The judgment, therefore, is immediate, not because something sudden is imposed, but because the formation has already reached completion. What is revealed is the final structure of what was freely built over time. Nothing about it is accidental. It is the full expression of a life lived in freedom, now seen without any remaining illusion or delay. At the center of all of this stands divine truth itself. It does not change, and it does not adapt to human perception or emotional response. It remains constant and absolute. At death, the soul encounters this truth directly for the first time without any mediation, and in that encounter, everything becomes fully visible in a single unified awareness. For some, this clarity brings sorrow mixed with understanding. For others, it brings unavoidable recognition of the path they have freely taken. But in every case, what defines the experience is truth itself, not emotion, not imagination, and not uncertainty. Nothing can alter what is revealed. It can only be understood. And in this final clarity, it becomes undeniable that judgment is not separate from divine love. It is an expression of it. Truth that hides itself would not be love, because it would leave the soul in illusion. Instead, love reveals truth completely so that nothing remains hidden. Even when that revelation is difficult, it is still ordered toward understanding, not confusion. As this awareness reaches its deepest point, the soul finds itself approaching the threshold of an even more decisive reality. Not only the recognition of truth, but the question of how it will now exist within the presence of God.